Welcome back, everybody. This is David Nabarro, your moderator at this global dialogue on trade and food systems. And I just wanted to really acknowledge superb sessions in the breakout rooms, wonderful facilitation, and a real willingness to look at some of the difficult issues. I'm well aware that trade negotiations are tight. There's not a lot of room for maneuver, and they're difficult to advance because you need to get agreement in so many different areas, and you're all very skillful at handling multifaceted negotiations. So as I traveled around and listened to you exploring some of the really difficult issues, what impressed me was that you were able to talk about the challenges of the negotiations, whilst at the same time, for some of you, very deeply involved in them. And that's a good sign. It's a very good sign in my view. Now, what I'd like to do now is to actually talk to Jean-Marie Paugam. He is Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He's been very much involved in all this, but quite recently, because I think most of you know that Jean-Marie is quite new. And I thought it was relevant, now that we've had these extensive discussions in the discussion groups, to invite Jean-Marie to just actually answer a few questions for us. It's nothing like being put on the spot when you're new into the job. I hope you don't mind. Well, here I come with my first question. Now, this global dialogue on trade shows that the World Trade Organization really is becoming much more active in the international discussion about the future of food systems. So why are you more active? And what do you think you, as the WTO, can contribute to the discussion that's underway? Jean-Marie, please.
Well, thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I think the answer to the why part of your question is pretty straightforward. As you know, agriculture remains the number one priority for a vast majority of our members. The WTO counts 164 members. There are approximately 3/4 of them who are developing countries. And it is a well-known fact that in developing countries, agriculture accounts for a lot of the output in the GDP and also of the employment. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, approximately 60% of the people would be employed in the agricultural sector. So this is a key sector, and trade is also a key factor of their growth strategies. As you know, the world trade in agriculture has been tripling roughly since the Uruguay round and the conclusion of the agricultural agreement. And many countries have benefited from this in witnessing a rise in their share of world trade, be it in Latin America, in Africa, or in Asia. And during this journey, food security has always been central to the WTO agenda. The aim of the rules being to enhance the access to and affordability of food to the greater number. And if you put all this together, it is not a surprise that agricultural trade would be considered as a means of implementation in the sense of the Sustainable Development Goals that the DG was referring to in her opening remark. And there are two of them who are really crucial in our discussion today, which are the eliminate hunger and the elimination of poverty. So this is why we are so active and keen on being part of the debate on food system through the international trade lenses. What the WTO does is, and this is the what part of your question, it does provide a international trade, international framework, not only for trade in food, but also for trade in everything which makes agriculture possible. I'm talking about the agricultural machinery, the tractors, the clothes, agricultural services, just like weather monitoring services, for instance. And the interest of the dialogue today, in my opinion, and you're right to pointing out that I have a quite a candid look of a newcomer, and I thought this was a very vivid dialogue. The beauty of it is to bring together a very broad range of participants from civil society, think tanks, labor unions, trade associations, businesses, big and small, government and international organizations. And you may grant me probably that I understand that you have been wondering, David, through the 10 breakout sessions, and you could testify that the questions that have been tackled there are very, very complicated and very important to discuss, be it trade distorting, agricultural subsidies, export restriction, which has been at the heart of some concerns during the pandemic, or even issues which are less visible, such as trade facilitation in food products, just to avoid waste of products at the frontier. So this is why we are being active in this discussion of food system. And I believe, from what I hear, that the discussion has been quite fruitful.
Well, I didn't go to all the groups, Jean-Marie, because I got so excited, actually. Firstly, I met a lot of people who I've worked with in previous roles that I've had, which is always good. But secondly, I have to say to you how impressed I am by the care with which all of those who were speaking actually tried to think about the position of the others that they were talking to. We've noticed in the dialogues that is making such a difference. And just, if you don't mind, I'd like to build on what you just said about the richness. You mentioned that food security is a central concern of WTO. How does international trade, in your view, interact with food security? Hasn't the interruption of global value chains during COVID demonstrated that the best answer to food security is to produce and buy local? And clearly that's coming out. But Jean-Marie, I'd love your take on this delicacy. Over to you.
Thank you again, David. It's good to hear what you mentioned about the spirit of the listening mode of its parts. I think that's very rewarding for our efforts to put this event together. You won't be surprised that I don't really think that the buy local or produce local be the silver bullet for food security. Not that it would be, we would see that as a bad thing in itself. There is nothing wrong about that, but it cannot be a systemic and robust answer to the issue of food security. Why is that? Once again, let me quote the opening remarks from Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, who just reminded us that 1 person out of 6 persons in the world is being fed thanks to international trade. So it's obvious from such a figure that international trade provides the underpinning of the food security for billions of people. And one of the good proof of that is that during the pandemic, you heard no voices from no country advocating for food self-sufficiency in the wake of the crisis. To the contrary, ministers of trade, especially Minister of Agriculture and Minister of Trade, especially in the forum of the G20, have been calling explicitly for refraining to take trade restrictive measures. And I mean, there is even a sort of now official language, codified language mentioning the idea of targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary measures. So I think the world has been really fully aware of the importance of trade for food security. And this also is related to the fundamentals of this trade. The trade in food is not really different from, it has taken the same kind of pattern that trade in industries, that is global value chains. And some people may even speak about assembled food. The terms may not sound very tempting for consumer, but this is the reality. If you take the simple example of a bar of chocolate, for instance, what is a bar of chocolate? First, you've got cocoa. 60% of it would come from Africa, mainly Ivory Coast and Ghana. Second, you've got milk. Most likely, it would come from big exporting countries such as New Zealand, Germany, the Netherlands, or the United States. Third, you will find some sugars, and here again, big exporting nations such as Brazil, Thailand, India, Guatemala, or my own country, France, would be involved in such trade. And I'm not mentioning all the other components which might also be included into that. So this notion of assembled food has a meaning. It comes from all around the world, and it shows the interdependence that we have. This is exactly the central point and the central stake of these discussions that we have been promoting through the global dialogue.
Jean-Marie, we've benefited enormously, I think, from that answer. Whether it's your metaphor about assembled foods and the chocolate bar, or your reference to targeted, proportional, transparent measures, which shows that WTO has got this adaptive capacity that we've seen, and I'm sure that's to your advantage. And that leads me now to my third and last question in my series. Jean-Marie, in the light of what you've just said, what do you hope to see emerge from the Food Systems Summit that the United Nations Secretary General will convene during the high-level segment of the United Nations General Assembly at the end of September this year? What do you really want this summit to focus on the issue of international trade? In other words, quite simply, what outcome from the summit would the WTO like to see?
Well, thank you for this question. Actually, our first goal is to make sure that the multilateral trading system does not operate in silo. You know, there used to be, there is an appellate body in the WTO, and the appellate body once used this expression that I find kind of telling and maybe beautiful. The world trading system does not operate in clinical isolation. So we don't want to operate in clinical isolation. We want to be able to provide input to the food system and the discussion of the food system, bearing in mind the importance that we just discussed before of international trade for food systems. So our first goal is to provide this input. Now, we would, there have been some of our members, 16 agricultural exporting countries, which have signed a statement for the food system to call for some elimination of the elimination of barriers into food. This will be a proposition in consideration. It will probably be discussed. What is, from a WTO Secretariat point of view, most important is that the world food system would deliver a message on the most important event for the WTO this year, which is our 12th Ministerial Conference. And we have the feeling, most of our members have the feeling that the key to a success in this conference is to be able to deliver a meaningful multilateral outcome on agriculture. There are many propositions from our members on the table. I will, of course, not prejudge which one will be successful enough to rally a consensus or which one would be prioritized by members. But if I just mention some of them, not all of them, you will see that they strike all at the heart of the discussions that you have been witnessing today on food systems. For instance, there are propositions on transparency in agricultural trade measures. There are propositions on discipline on export restrictions, including through a very important poverty angle. There is one proposition, which is co-sponsored by many members, to exempt the programs, the supply of the World Food Programme from export restrictions. There are propositions on issues directly related to food security, such as public stock holding programs, and also a particular focus on the sector of cotton. and also market-related discussions which have an impact on food security. And clearly, one of the central questions for all the members is domestic support, so trade distorting subsidies and other subsidies. And these negotiations are key to strengthen the WTO agreement on agriculture. So what we really hope from the food summit in September, and indeed even from the pre-summit, which is just around the corner, will be that it puts a spotlight on international trade and calls somehow for a successful conclusion of our agricultural negotiations.
Well, that is a very clear purpose. It's interesting that you describe the route into the negotiations on agriculture, the multiple propositions that are on the table, member states selecting priorities, and you mention issues like transparency, export restriction, domestic support, building up stockholding capacity, all these important things that could make the trading system something that really contributes to the kind of food systems that the world needs by 2030. Really, really excellent to have this interaction with you this afternoon. Welcome to your new role. I hope you find it really incredibly satisfying. And on behalf of all of us, Jean-Marie, thank you for giving us your reflections on the issues, reflections that we will hold with us as the pre-summit, which, as you said, is just around the corner on the 26th to 28th of July, and the summit itself in September as they appear. And so, Jean-Marie, I go back to the main group now, and it is my duty to bring this global dialogue on trade to a close. We may finish a minute or two early. I think that is perfectly okay. That means that our colleagues have been very, very efficient with the various different organizational pieces they've had to put in place. But as we prepare for the departure, I do want to thank everybody who's been involved in this dialogue and everybody who's been involved in all the global dialogues, all the national dialogues, all the independent dialogues, all the regional dialogues for this Food Systems Summit. I can't tell you exactly how many people are involved, but it is many, many thousands in one of the biggest multi-centered dialogues that I've ever known about the future of food systems. It's all happening in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and it is quite extraordinary to see the number of different groups who have just said, yes, food and food systems matter. There are challenging issues, rather than simply just shout at each other. Instead, we would like to engage in dialogue because we think that is an essential way to go. And so here today, Global Dialogue on Trade, a unique occasion to discuss the many complex interrelationships between international trade and food systems. Now, I think the conclusion I reach, and that very much influenced by what Ngozi said at the beginning and what Jean-Marie said at the end, but also what I've heard from you, I have to say there is no doubt that well-functioning international trade is vital for people to be able to feed themselves. And not only that, because we are all so dependent on each other, trade really matters. And I can only say that this afternoon has reinforced that feeling in me. Trade really matters, but we have to keep getting it right. And that's why your forthcoming ministerial meeting with the focus on agriculture trade is so important. I think what we saw today was that in governance, interdependence has to be managed. Sometimes people argue that the way to deal with interdependence is to take firm lines. I think, of course, principled positioning is vital, but what you've shown today is listening and appreciating the perspectives of others matters just as much as stating one's own perspective strongly. After all, systems are complex, and unless the different stakeholders are able to exchange in the way that you have done today, it's going to be really hard for them to shift in a way that all stakeholders find to be within their limits of acceptability. I hope that you're going to walk out of this dialogue feeling more informed, feeling more inspired, and I hope also feeling stronger, because there's a lot of work to do. On everybody's behalf, as well as thanking our co-conveners, Dr. Kalibata and Dr. Ngozi Iweala, I would like to really thank all in WTO who have made this event possible. The technical teams who have looked after the internet connectivity for us, and they've done it in a way that is almost imperceptible, the sign of a really strong technical team. Also, all the WTO personnel who joined the individual rooms and were there as resource persons, quietly listening, ready to advise the facilitators if they needed help. Thank you, all of you. A special thanks to Doa Abdel Muttal of WTO. I see that you're being recognized, Doa, in the chat. You yourself took the initiative, put this together, worked with our team, worked with the Food Systems Summit Secretariat, and have made this a dialogue that has worked. One colleague wrote in the chat to me privately saying he thinks this is one of the best dialogues he's been at since we started working on the summit. Chapeau to you, Doa. I'd also like to thank all the personnel from the Food Systems Summit Secretariat, from my own team in 4SD, and from all other groups who've been working front of house or behind house to make this event work. All of you, it's not possible to mention you by name, but you've really contributed such a lot. And it is these kinds of events, I submit, that really does make food system transformation a real possibility. By listening to each other and understanding where we come from, we're better able to address some of these massive challenges that exist in today's food systems. And we've got to get them right as we look forward to 2030, the year of the SDGs. With that, on behalf of all of us, I am using my prerogative as your curator to invite us to thank each other and to appreciate what a really informative afternoon we've had. I wish you well. Stay in touch. Stay safe. Goodbye.